Every week on Shift Key, the podcast that I co-host with Jesse Jenkins here at Heatmap News, we take a look at one piece of climate news from the week. If it's upbeat, if it's making us feel good about the energy transition, it is an upshift. If it's making us feel more pessimistic about the energy transition, then it's a downshift. Jesse, I feel like we were doing upshifts. We had a great year there. Lots of upshifts. So many upshifts. And now it's just nothing but downshifts. Downshifts all the time.
We've been trying to find some diamonds in the rough and give you something to be excited about, but I'm afraid this week I don't have one of those for you.
Okay, Jesse, what do you got? What do you have?
Yeah, I've got a downshift for you this week, which is first quarter sales in the United States of plug-in hybrid and battery electric vehicles were flat this year for the first quarter so far. Electric vehicle sales are actually down from the fourth quarter, but overall battery EVs are about 8% of US light vehicle sales. That's all cars, trucks, and SUVs. And plug-in hybrids are another 2%, so about a 10% combined share. That's basically exactly where we were over the course of the year in 2024. It seems, I would imagine, that this is continuing to be Tesla's struggles in the market, but I'd have to dive into the sales totals vehicle by vehicle to figure out exactly what's going on. Obviously, the uncertainty around tariffs is probably not helping consumer confidence and overall sales as well. We would hope to see a continued increase in EV sales shares. At least for the first quarter of the year, that's not the case. Should note, though, of course, that these quarterly values bump up and down, and we've seen this in the past. And so we'll keep an eye on whether this is a sustained trend for a couple quarters or if this is just a first quarter thing and the rest of the year it looks a little bit better.
It is so funny. I mean, Elon was on 60 Minutes this past weekend, basically being like, yeah, I don't agree with everything this administration does, but I really know how to talk about it. It feels like he's figured out the idea that companies should be politically neutral from first principles. But
Little
along the way,
Elon.
along the way, decided to be more involved than any other Fortune 500 CEO in recent American history
since the war board of
yeah, which I don't want to excuse. I don't want to say that I don't want to grant total credence to what he's saying now. I think to some degree he's doing cleanup now and knew what he was doing when he chose to be the second or third most powerful person in the Trump administration for the first few months. But it is interesting times.
Brand reputation does matter. Rob, what do you have for us?
I have another downshift. I have a downshift, Jesse. The Secretary of Energy, Chris Wright, clawed back on Friday 24 grants for projects to cut emissions from heavy industry. Those grants came to $3.7 billion, and they would have helped companies build first of a kind or second of a kind or early scale demonstration projects in what we sometimes call hard to decarbonize industries. These are like heavy industrial or light industrial companies that use a process that's particularly carbon intensive. And the government was going to pitch in to help them create new facilities that would demonstrate first of a kind, early scale technologies that could then potentially be scaled to the rest of the economy. These companies worked in food and beverage and steel making and cement and chemicals productions. And Chris Wright was just like, nope, we're not funding. These are largely funded by the Office of Clean Energy Demonstration, which the Trump administration seems to have particular antipathy for. I think of some interest here is that the two largest projects, a number of large projects here, were to support carbon capture demonstration projects. They went to Exxon.
And I should note those projects were funded, I think, by the carbon capture demonstration funds from the bipartisan infrastructure law, rather than the industrial demo program that was largely funded by the Inflation Reduction Act. So this was a bipartisan bill that funded those.
I think it's kind of important to dwell here because there's two particular theories of change in climate politics that have been damaged, if not
are being actively tested.
Well, there's the first big theory of why the IRA should work that's being actively tested right now, but there's actually two others that I really want to spend time on. The first is that some people say the IRA is now being tested by Congress because it was too partisan, and actually all climate action should be done through bipartisan bills, and Joe Biden could have passed a bipartisan climate bill if he had tried. Well, he did pass bipartisan climate policy in the IIJA, the bipartisan infrastructure law, and hasn't stopped the Trump administration from coming in and tearing it apart. Doesn't matter how many Republican senators it seems like you get on your side. It doesn't matter if Mitch McConnell votes for the law. Trump administration doesn't like it. Republican energy officials and the type of people who work in Republican energy administrations don't like it. And so it got killed. So that's theory number one. not looking too hot. Theory number 2 is that carbon capture is actually just a giveaway to the oil and gas industry, and that when Democrats support carbon capture, even though the science says that carbon capture and direct air capture especially might be important tools to achieve our deep decarbonization and net zero goals, I think there's some folks who say, no, that is theoretically true, but in American politics, what you're really just doing here is subsidizing the fossil fuel industry and doing the bidding of what Republicans and the fossil fuel industry would do anyway. I also think that idea is not looking too hot, because here you have Republicans coming in and yanking those grants away. It turns out Republicans don't want the fossil fuel industry to develop carbon capture technology. They don't want anyone to have carbon capture technology because they reject the premise that carbon emissions are dangerous at all. And in fact, they would rather not have any evidence out there that this technology works or that you could deploy it at scale, because that might open the door to regulation. And so this idea that CCS was some kind of giveaway that the Biden administration was doing to fossil fuel companies and reflected the evil influence of the fossil fuel companies on this putatively decarbonization-focused Biden administration. But if the Biden administration had really cared about climate emissions, they wouldn't be funding these CCS technologies. What we've actually seen is that what a Republican administration does is not come in and fund CCS research and not come in and fund CCS projects. What they do is they come in and yank all the funding away because they don't want a speck of evidence out there that you could ever deploy this at scale, and they don't want the oil companies to get invested at all in the idea that this might be a technology that could work for them. I just think that this is a really important touchstone here, because there's a lot of talk about fly specking. I don't think the Biden administration was perfect. I think it was a big problem that, for instance, the president couldn't talk. I think some theories the Biden administration had about how the IRA would work are really being tested right now, if not disproven. But there are folks who come in, speaking of fly specking, and say the Biden administration should have done more climate policy on a bipartisan basis, and they shouldn't have done anything on CCS because that's a giveaway to the fossil fuel industry. And I think both of those ideas have been really disproven by the way the right-led energy department has acted. I think it's a massive bummer, because it means that what we're seeing is that, at least with the Republican Party and its current dispensation, you can't do a lot in the upper legislature. You can't do a lot in the Senate to create bipartisan consensus around climate policy if one of the founding ideas of the current Republican Trump era energy establishment is that climate policy is always and everywhere a bad thing.
Yeah, I think that's all great points. I also couldn't let this one go by without noting that the putative reason why these particular grants were selected for cancellation is that they were all grants where the agreements were finalized after the election. And so this is in keeping with this idea that the EPA has also put forward, that, they're trying to throw up all this money at the last minute, and therefore there's evidence of fraud, and they're not looking out for the taxpayers' money. And so that's the reason why these grants should be taken back. I think the reality is that actually, because of the length of time they went through to vet these grants, that's what pushed their final approval back after the election. And so all of these projects went through an extensive vetting process before selection that went for months, if not years.
Here's the conversation we really need to have, which is, why did it take so long to do the vetting?
Perhaps they should have got them all done much earlier.
Permitting laws. It's permitting laws. When you talk to people in the Biden administration about why these projects took so long, it's the permitting laws. I mean, and because they were vetting the projects, they were making sure they were dotting all their I's. But like the actual statutes that require the most intensive form of dotting the I's and crossing the T's were the permitting laws. And when people say, oh, permitting keeps the government from acting quickly, it reduces state capacity because the government can't do anything quickly. This is an example where if this money had been out the door and the contracts had been signed and everything was completed, if the steel was in the ground and the concrete was poured, you wouldn't be able to yank this money away because the thing would be done and operating.
Yep.
It's the fact that they didn't get the money out because they had to do 2 years of permitting procedure that this money could even be yanked away in the first place.
I think that's right. Well, double downshift.
Thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed this and other feisty conversations about climate change and energy policy, you can find us wherever you get your podcasts or at heatmap.news. But listen, we're on Spotify. We're on Apple Podcasts. We're on the weird French one, whose name I can't remember. We're on Overcast, the one that Marco Arment makes. All of those, we're on all of them. Search for Shift Key with Robinson Meyer and Jesse Jenkins. And thanks so much for listening.